Well, welcome to session 4 on job analysis. Can you feel the excitement building? I'll bet you are all just sitting there on the edge of your seats, just tingling with anticipation. And for those of you who are fortunate enough to be experiencing those sensations right now, you really need to get a life. You see, job analysis is boring, at least in my opinion. A few years back, my wife and I were with my daughter and son-in-law on a trip to Dallas, Texas. We were all attending a conference, and during one of the days off, we rented a car and took a tour of the surrounding area. My wife and I used to live in the Dallas-Fort Worth vicinity for 2 years after we were married. Naturally, our tour concentrated on finding our old abodes and our old hanging out places and marveling at how the place had changed in only 40 years, imagine that, and telling story after story about our young adventure in Texas. Our daughter and son-in-law nodded their heads, appropriately intoned surprise and astonishment for over 4 hours. Later, they confessed that it was one of the most boring times of their lives. But they did it because they felt they had to. They had to endure it because it had a positive outcome for someone else, namely my wife and I. Such is job analysis. It's necessary. You have to do it. And it has positive outcomes for others, but it's still boring. Now, I'm sure compensation specialists would vehemently argue that point, but to each his own. It is indeed a very necessary task and one that is important for all organizations. You must have a way to describe jobs and specify the talents, traits, and skills needed to perform those jobs. Further, you need to have some mechanism to evaluate those jobs. Some way to compare jobs one to another and place a value on them so pay is appropriate to the contribution of the job to the organizational success. That's obviously important, but it still doesn't make it any less boring. In this lecture, I'll start out with a brief recap of where we've been. It's important to stop at some point and review and put into context the topics we've already covered. We will then launch into the topic of job analysis, leaning heavily on the text material. The authors do a good job of covering the topic, and I'll only try to add a bit of clarity here and there. But once again, we use job analysis in our personal lives, but we just don't realize it. When you decided to enroll in college, I'll bet one question that bounced around in your brain was, I wonder what a college student really does. I wonder what skills I need to be a good college student. I wonder what college professors expect and require. Is it different than high school? You started collecting data, and in your head, you developed a description for student and a list of specifications you can compare to yourself. You engaged in job analysis of the student's occupation, and that was an important step to prepare you to be a student and to be successful. See, once again, it's real life. So let's explore the boring but real world of job analysis. Chapter 4, Job Analysis. Sometimes as we go forward in classes, we tend to treat each session as a separate learning activity and miss the connection between important topics. So before we go jumping off into job analysis, let's do a little recap and figure out just exactly where we are, and perhaps more importantly, where we're going from here. In the first 3 sessions, we have really been focusing at a rather high level in the organization, or on things external to the organization. We spoke of jobs in passing, but didn't really dive down into the guts of the organization. Well, this week we're going to be getting into the guts part. We will be talking about determining what people do on the shop floor or the sales floor or in the patient room, etc. But we can't forget those high-level things we discussed. The organizational structure and strategy, the business strategy, and the legal climate define what jobs do. They define what job content is necessary to be successful in performing those jobs, which leads to organizational success. How can we possibly look for and find good people who will lead us to success if we don't understand what those good people need to do? So the link between strategy and jobs is straight line and obvious when you think about it. I guess what I'm saying is, it's a fact that the base of selecting the right people for any job is an understanding of what is needed to do the job. Sounds simple, but there are many methods and tools available to gain that understanding, as the text indicates. Actually, it's more than an understanding. It's being able to communicate those details to others so there is consistency in our recruiting and selection efforts. Everyone involved in the staffing, selection, and recruiting process must sing from the same songbook in terms of what is required for the job. If there is chaos in the understanding of the job and what is required to perform the position effectively, there will be chaos in the ultimate selection decision. And that kind of chaos creates bad outcomes for organizations. And as you will see in the second half of this class, job analysis is directly hooked to compensation as well. You'll see some of this information again when we discuss building internally consistent compensation systems in week 12. Simply put, poor job analysis and job descriptions make us look for the wrong things in our staffing efforts and makes us pay for the wrong things in our pay and reward system. Either we look for the wrong traits and skills because we have identified the wrong tasks that must be accomplished, or if the job description is outdated, we look for the things we needed yesterday and not today and tomorrow. Either scenario is not good. The text defines job analysis as, quote, the process that staffing professionals use to first identify the tasks required by a job and then evaluate what is required to perform each of the tasks that comprise the job. The process can be a strategic tool that results in a competitive advantage if it aligns the requirements of a job with the company's business strategy, taking into account what is required to perform the job today as well as in the future. End quote. Our tendency is to think of an outcome where a job analysis lists the skills or traits for a job. We can then take that list and search for an individual who possesses those traits. It's like a checklist. The applicants have this and this and this, or they don't have that and that. And that's true to a point, but it's a little more complex than that. It's not only about what skills are possessed, it's also about how much or to what extent do candidates possess those skills. Using a sports analogy, a lot of people can throw a football and do so accurately. But how accurately and how far can they throw it? And can they throw it quickly enough or with the right finesse? So when looking for a pro football quarterback, how much is more important than the mere presence of the trait? And identifying and measuring how much is the real tricky part. If we are preparing a dish, cooking in other words, we know what we want it to look like in the end, but there are many variables that affect that outcome. Although the dish may look the same regardless of where it's prepared or who prepares it, the dish may taste very differently. The variation in taste comes from the different amounts of ingredients included. We may make our dish spicier or saltier or more moist or whatever. Jobs may look the same on the outside, but internally may be very different depending on the mix of knowledge, skills, abilities, tasks, and responsibilities that may make up the final product. That's dependent upon the organization, the current situation, the resources available, to name just a few of the situational factors. I'm sure you have watched these cooking shows on TV and noticed that there is a particular recipe for a specific dish. But the chef doesn't follow the recipe as described. Instead of meticulously measuring a teaspoon of salt, the chef sprinkles the salt based on how he or she feels about the dish. Instead of measuring 3 cups of water, they just pour water into the bowl until it feels or looks right. I, on the other hand, meticulously measure each ingredient. I follow the recipe to the letter. That's why I cook and I don't create. Chefs practice the art of cooking and I merely cook. We use the same ingredients, but just in different proportions depending on the situation and the variables at hand. So you can see the difficult part of filling open positions in an organization is coming up with a list of skills, traits, etc. It's not coming up with a recipe, it's identifying the how much. I don't know about you, but if I'm running a fine restaurant, I want a chef and not a cook. When running a successful company, I don't want someone who has the right list of traits. I want someone who has the traits in the right proportion. Successful organizations have HR professionals who create job analysis processes like chefs create dishes and not cooks. Pick a job, any job. Student, baker, attorney, firefighter, welder, teacher, quarterback, coach, HR professional, President of the United States. All are jobs we see all the time, but what do they really do and what is really required in that particular job from incumbents? What traits and skills are necessary to accomplish those activities? And not only accomplish them, but accomplish them well. We see these jobs constantly, but still can't fully discern the task and requirements of those jobs. An effective job analysis process identifies those properties of the job in the right proportion in as objective a manner as possible. I should also point out that as objective as possible implies that it is not a completely objective process. Job analysis still requires some subjective assumptions and decisions. It still depends on the judgment of the job incumbents and others. Let me give you an example. When doing a job analysis, or when hiring for, let's say, a human resource professional, I may require 7 to 10 years of experience. But based on the current situation and anticipated needs, I may require nearer 10 years experience and desire that experience to be in the electronics industry, for example. Same ingredients, but different proportions. Let's look at the job of President of the United States. That job description and specifications fill the airwaves every day, and we all have our own idea of what is really involved in doing a good job as president. I bet if we all wrote a job description for this position, they'd all be different. Some would emphasize some aspects of the job and de-emphasize other aspects. Others would emphasize different parts of the job. And those emphases would differ depending on the state of the nation, current events, the current and past incumbents of the job, etc. If a job analysis was totally objective and a scientific process, all the job descriptions would be the same. Obviously, that's not the case. Job analysis activities leaves room for interpretation and subjectivity, and that's a good thing. I know what you're thinking. That's not a good example. The job of president is too complex. It changes all the time. That's true, but the basics of the job are the same. It requires certain skills and traits and experience to initially perform all of the duties. But the emphasis or weight of those skills, traits, and experiences is what changes with different situations. But isn't that the same with all jobs? We can readily see it in the president's job, but how about the job of parent? Isn't the job description of a parent different today than it was in previous generations? Actually, doesn't the job description of a parent change as the child grows older? Parental responsibilities and tasks when a child is 2 years old are vastly different than when the child reaches 16. The job changes with time. The basics are the same, but the importance, emphasis, and weight of certain required skills changes. So why can't we just keep following the same recipe? Because the jobs keep changing. They keep changing with the internal and external environment. And thus we have stumbled on one of the main problems with the job analysis process. The results must be reviewed and modified regularly. I've worked in organizations where the job descriptions and specifications were a decade old or more. The organization's expressed expectations and requirements were outdated. When hiring, we were looking for things we needed a long time ago instead of what we need right now, let alone what we needed in the future. Job analysis is not a task on a to-do list that can be checked off and forgotten. It's an ongoing process with real consequences. Finally, the job analysis can either be a useful tool that leads us in our quest to fill openings with the best people and pay all people fairly, or it can be a bureaucratic waste of time. Is job analysis a bureaucratic waste of time or necessary for the organization? Well, the answer to those questions depends simply on what you do with the data you collect in the job analysis. Job analysis is a waste of time and an important function depending on the organization and investment put into the process. Let politics in the process and it will quickly become a waste of time. Apply the data professionally and it will become a very useful management tool. When I worked for RCA, I was in charge of compensation. We conducted job analysis and job evaluations based on a point factor system which had been in place for decades. The organization had job descriptions that were decades old. I jokingly used to tell managers to tell me what pay grade they wanted the job to have, and I could get it there. Our job analysis process had evolved into a bureaucratic boondoggle. It was a waste of time and effort, but the bureaucracy required the activity. When working for the Noel Group, we developed a job analysis process with the help of outside consultants that was simple and very useful. It worked great and was very beneficial to the organization. Our job analysis allowed us to compare jobs within the organization and also with the marketplace. It provided consistency and stability in our pay system. So just like any other HR program or sales program or research program or any other program for that matter, job analysis can be an important function that contributes much to the organization or a weight around the organization's neck that helps strangle growth and encourages mediocrity. Remember, job analysis is merely collecting data on the subject job. That data results in job descriptions and job specifications. Garbage in, garbage out. The question is not, do we need the data? Of course we do. We need to know what people do or should do and what kinds of people we should hire to do those things. Needing the data is not a question. What we do with the data determines the value of the job analysis process. To put it in the context of home, do you need a personal or family budget? Absolutely you do. You should know how you are spending your money. You should know if your spending habits are good or bad. You should know if you are in good financial shape or standing on the brink of bankruptcy. But the real test of the effectiveness and usefulness of a budget process is, what do you do with the data? Do you use the data to formulate better spending habits? Do you use the data to plan for the future? Do you use the data to develop tools and processes of analysis that will improve your life? Or do you use the data merely to explain why you are on the brink of disaster to your spouse, parents, creditors, etc.? Or do you use the data to provide inflexible barriers to new investment that may be beneficial for you? In other words, does your budget become a limiting factor that prevents necessary risk and reach success? What do you do with the data? That is the effectiveness question around budgeting and around job analysis as well. My opinion is that job analysis is a necessary process. It's important, but it can get away from you and your organization, so take care in its development and management. How much detail to include in data and how the organization uses the data is a judgment call. And I agree, judgment is subjective. It is actually the subjective application of objective data. Our discussion next week will encompass 2 chapters, but they're related. If we now understand the composition of our jobs, we can start the planning process for searching for good people to fill those jobs.